So, Patrick, we're kind of in a transition period here. We've got about 40 days left of the Trump presidency, and Biden is naming his economic and foreign policy teams. And we have a president, I think New York Times had an article recently, Peter Baker, who said that his rage and detached from reality refusal to concede defeat evoke images of a besieged overlord in some distant land, defiantly clinging to power.
Down the times for overstatement when it comes to Donald Trump.
It is difficult, isn't it?
If you want to talk about derangement and refusal to accept reality, I think we have to start with the Times and all those other people who foisted Russiagate on us and subjected us to all that preposterous junk for 4 years. Dreadful, inexcusable.
Well, and ultimately what it did was it made Trump personally the issue, so that they really didn't have to discuss any kind of policy.
Let's start right there, if we may.
Yes.
That has always been a very, very serious shortcoming in the reasoning, if that is my term, of the anti-Trumpers. It all started with Trump, right? Mm-hmm. It did not all start with Trump. It started long before Trump. It started long before Barack Obama. It started a long time ago, indeed, okay? Mm-hmm. Depending on how far out you want to extend your telescope, it started with the Dulles brothers in the 50s, okay? But certainly Barack Obama, while many among us idealize him, had a very problematic foreign policy presidency, okay? And Trump was not the cause of anything, not domestically and not on the foreign policy side. He was a symptom of the failings of neoliberal strategies and presumptions, intervention, humanitarian intervention, responsibility to protect, and all that other rubbish, right?
Right. Mm-hmm.
Look, this is a problem now worth noting because this faulty reasoning now results in the Biden appointments. All we have to do is go back to where we were. Restoration. He's a restorationist. Mm-hmm. That is not what we need, and we are not in for a very fun 4 years on the basis of the appointments he has so far announced.
No, and it seems that certainly foreign policy and probably an economic policy as well, that we are going to revisit the same failed policies that gave us Donald Trump in the first place.
Right. I'd like to add something here, Charles, if I may.
Mm-hmm. Please.
The anti-Trumpers, nothing Donald Trump said or did could possibly be any good. If he said the sky was blue on Tuesday morning, mm-hmm. they'd figure out a way to contradict him. That's another problem, right? Their position on Trump was so emotionally charged and also charged with other inexcusable things like taste. I think Trump's vulgarity got them going, right? Mm-hmm. I eventually want to write something about all that, right? But I think as Trump takes the exit, I think it's very important to recognize some of the things he stood for that were worth standing for. Better relations with Russia. Yes. An end to animosity with the Russians. An end to the wars of adventure and wastage, human life wastage, taxpayer money wastage, the deprivations the Pentagon budget mm-hmm. requires of Americans here at home, et cetera, right? And perhaps not most of all, but let us not forget, Trump's cardinal sin was to confront the permanent government in this country otherwise known as the deep state, and I have no trouble with the term.
Mm-hmm.
Something that was worth doing. They got him, as they always were going to. But, he did us all a favor by exposing all that. Nobody spoke about the deep state under Obama or any previous president. It was the presence that was never acknowledged. It was the elephant in the room. Mm-hmm. Trump did us a favor. He said, this is what's going on. This is what we have to confront. These people are subversive. They're attempting a coup. I quite agree. I've said it in print several times, right? Mm-hmm. Not since Eisenhower's industrial complex speech in January 1961 have we had a president so honest about the permanent state.
Yeah, I would agree with that. And the corollary of that, or the reflection of that, is that the never-Trumpers and the Democrats, particularly the Democrats, began then to see the CIA and the FBI and the NSA and all the other alphabet soup to be great patriots because they were pushing the Russiagate narrative, and they were out to get Trump, so they must be our friends, right? Yeah. Which anybody that remembers the 60s and 70s should know better.
You go right to my point. Certain age, okay? I take it from your splendid beard. You are too.
Yes.
No. As I wrote in one of my columns a long while ago, I'm starting to feel like I have nitrogen sickness. Which way is up and which way is down? We all understood what the CIA was all about years ago. Its malign practices in every context you can name, and some you probably can't think of, right? Suddenly, the descendants of the 60s generation think these guys are just terrific, believe every word they say, proven felonious liars like John Brennan and that other horror, Clapper, right?
Yeah.
If we lived in a just society that abided by its own legal codes, Clapper would be in prison. He was caught absolutely straight out lying to Congress. It's on tape. Anybody can see it, right? And these people are glorified. Quite shocking.
It really is.
We're rudderless, right? That applies in a dozen different contexts, but in the one we're talking about, how to understand the malignant cancer of our intelligence services operating on domestic soil, which is against the law, right?
Yes.
We're lost on that.
And it seems, to move back on foreign policy, one of the only time that I can recall where Trump was actually praised for an effort in the Middle East was when he bombed Syria.
Right.
That apparently was great. He showed presidential leadership.
Those beautiful weapons.
Yes.
Remember that?
I do. Yeah.
Perverse. Goes back to our earlier point, Charles. Suddenly the dreadful is beautiful, right?
Yes. Yes. Down is up, and
right.
But let's pursue a little more. Because Trump did make efforts, gestures at least, if you will, toward getting us out of Syria, out of Iraq, and out of Afghanistan, all of which one has to applaud, unless you're on MSNBC. But then there are a couple of places where Trump actually exacerbated tensions and made a tense situation worse. And I'm thinking primarily of Iran, but also China. Maybe we can start with Iran.
Let's. To understand what has gone on in Iran, you need to understand a couple of things about the Trump administration. Okay, it's easily the most discombobulated, dysfunctional administration in my lifetime. And what I mean by that is Trump stood for certain things, negotiation over warfare and so on, right? The North Korean case. He wanted to negotiate with the Iranians too.
Mhm.
And your listeners need to recognize Trump was surrounded with people who were constantly subverting his stated intentions. He was ready to meet President Rouhani, notably at the UN General Assembly
Mhm.
in 2018, I think. It might have been 19, but and they were really very close to meeting, assuming Rouhani would have been interested, right? On the sidelines of the UN General Assembly, Pompeo and John Bolton, at that time National Security Advisor, actively scuttled the prospect, right?
Mhm.
Um,
Right.
but, Trump is, in the way of a New York business real estate developer, a deal maker. He loves the
Mhm.
deal, right? He wanted to shine with a deal. Um, and whatever his motivations, that was a good way at it with the North Koreans, but we're now talking about the Iranians, right? Now,
Right.
so that's what happened there. Now, the second thing I think your listeners need to understand about Trump and what went on these past 4 years is that often when he was gazumped or sabotaged by the hawks around him, he was kind of almost captive, right? For the sake of saving face, he would turn around and say, yeah, let's bomb them, right? The classic case here involves Iran, the assassination of General Soleimani last January. Pompeo and Mark Esper, Secretary of Defense, hatched that plan in Washington. All this is in the record, but you have to find it. Hatched that plan in Washington while Trump was down playing golf at Mar-a-Lago in Florida. Okay,
Right.
they
Mhm.
got on a plane, the two of them. They got on a plane to Florida and presented Trump with this plan as a fait accompli. All right, and Trump had no choice. He had to sign on and then represent himself as ordering it. I don't think he did order it. It's very opaque, but I don't think he ordered it. So we have the phenomenon of Trump covering his backside and his weakness by signing on to things that were imposed upon him by others.
Right. I'm going to get back to that, but the other situation is the Chinese situation, where we have both a trade war going on, demonization of China for having given us the virus, and other reasons, and we have increased military buildup in the South China Sea and other places on the Chinese border,
Mm-hmm.
which was begun under Obama, admittedly, and is a long-term goal of the deep state. But I didn't see, and maybe you found it, but I didn't see any attempt by Trump to overcome that, to actually go in a different direction.
All right. Well, Trump, the deal maker, Trump, the Manhattan real estate developer, right? That's where his head is, okay? Um, there were two sides to the China policy under Trump, speaking very broadly, of course, all right? Trump was hammering away about economic questions, tariffs, jobs, all that.
Mm-hmm.
I think he had the wrong end of the stick in many ways. You know,
Yeah.
China never forced an American company to invest in China. China never forced an American company to fire 500 workers so they could all get all the work done on the mainland, right? These were our choices. I think some remarkable proportion of Chinese exports uh, influencing the trade balance
Mm-hmm.
are produced in China by American companies, right? So
Yes.
there's all that. So he may have had it wrong and had it rather crude with the tariffs and all that, right? But he was into the economic side of the relationship. I'm not a China hawk. I think that side of the relationship needs to be reconsidered simply because China has climbed so swiftly up the development ladder. So there's that. But the other side of the relationship was security. The South China Sea, the force posture of America, the American presence at the western end of the Pacific, right? Mm-hmm. Making sure China is cast as a dangerous adversary. This was not Trump's thing. This was, again, Pompeo and the Pentagon, right? They're the ones who did all this. And all those silly admirals who were, standing on the decks of aircraft carriers pretending to be MacArthur reincarnate or something, right? This was all military stuff, national security stuff, intelligence, the Pentagon, the entire national security apparatus. These are the ones that were pumping up that side of the relationship. Mm-hmm. Trump was rather silent on that stuff if you look at the record.
Yeah, okay. I could buy that. And I somewhat understand why Trump ended up choosing as his cabinet and inner circle people who are wedded to the American imperialist hegemony over the world and militarism and all this other stuff. The Boltons and Pompeos. I mean, he hired them after all. But the question I have, and we don't see Biden is hiring them as well. His are just a little more polite. I sometimes wonder, is it possible for a president to have brought in people who were in opposition to the American exceptional, endless war idea?
Yeah. Pretty slim pickings, Charles. It's pretty hard to find people like that in Washington.
Yes.
You raise a very interesting question. What were all those people doing in the Trump White House? What was Pompeo doing at State? And Bolton? Shocking. McMaster. Right? What are they doing there? Why would a president who has no time for the notion of exceptionalism, he's on the record on that point, right? His quotation is, I've never liked the term. I'm exceptional, you're not. I don't think it's a very nice term. That's his quotation. Right?
No.
What were they doing there? Well, Trump is a New Yorker. He was absolutely a fish out of water in Washington. That's point one. He had no connections there of any worth, right. Substantial worth, use. That's point one. Point two is yours. Who's he going to choose from? Mm-hmm. And point three, I think those people were in many ways imposed upon him. Let's not forget, our president has been for some while a figurehead. This notion of the deep state happened to surface during the Trump administration. It's been a reality for a very long time. And I think Trump was basically told, these are your people. That created the inevitable, the ineluctable schizophrenia of this administration. Right? I want your listeners to know I don't have a whole lot of time for Trump. Right? I don't want to sound like a Trump man, but I do think it's important to make perfectly elementary high school distinctions when it comes to those few things he stood for that were worthwhile. And not to push the point too far, but I tip my cap to him in one way. I thought he would cave and give up on these questions of relations with Russia, troop drawdowns and all that. He hung right in there. These were his genuine convictions. The record indicates that now.
It's just very difficult to bring those into reality.
Yeah.
But I appreciate what you're saying about Trump. I mean, I think one of the things that we do in this country is part of our, hyper partisanship is that, we take figures like Trump and there's nothing good about Trump. And then we take a figure like Obama. Well, there's nothing bad about Obama. Well, neither of those statements is true. And,
Yes.
and we end up at a point where people do not want to criticize, anyone that is technically within their side of the aisle, because you're seen as a traitor. If you criticize Biden or Obama, Biden was very clearly, I think, the weakest possible candidate the Democrats could have put forward, and his only attribute, my way of thinking, is that he wasn't Trump.
Yeah.
But yeah, we've gotten to this thing where we can't really talk like grown-ups.
I know.
We have to, it's very difficult. But yeah, we are getting back to pretty much the same crowd. I mean, I don't know that there is a great deal of difference between the, maybe you can explain, between the conservative, militarists and diplomatic people and the theoretically liberal ones, going from the people who are humanitarian interventionists and so forth. It's just like there's not a whole lot of difference in the neoliberal economic policy of the Democrats and Republicans either.
To a certain extent, I don't want to reduce this. I don't want to be reductionist about this. But one element of it, and there are several, but one element of it is pure style, right?
Yes.
And the constant, right? The basso ostinato is empire, right?
Right.
Republicans propose to conduct empire in one fashion, and the Democrats propose to give it a kinder face. It's empire with a human face, right?
Mm-hmm.
And as long as we pursue empire and insist on it, there will not be peace in the world, because I don't think history has a single example. Maybe, I don't know, I'd rather doubt it, a single example of a people that likes to be subjugated to an imperial power, right? No. People want to be themselves. South Koreans want to be South Koreans, right? Syrians want to be Syrians. And so it's the question of empire and the sort of ideological driver of empire. There are two of them. One is exceptionalism. Mm-hmm. We are humanity's light in the darkness, right? Correct. And the other, it was pointed out to me some years ago, is more pernicious, actually. We dwell on exceptionalism a lot, but we don't think too much about, sufficiently about universalism. And universalism is the really dangerous element of our ideology. We can sit around in our living rooms and think of ourselves as exceptional all we want. It's universalism that, and the world can just sort of shrug or chuckle. It's universalism that causes the trouble, because it is our universalist ideology that propels us to around the world, imposing our will on others in the name of righteous, in the name of righteous goodness, right?
I've not heard that term used before in this context. Maybe you can explain a little bit, more of what you mean by universalist.
Universalism means our forms of government, our ways of thinking, on a philosophic plane, our understanding of the world is universally applicable. It is good for everybody if they are like us, right?
Yes.
The Cold War was waged between two nations, both professing universalist ideologies. Communism was also a universalist ideology. Okay.
Right.
I tend to think I have a very unfashionable view of the Cold War. I tend to think that the Russians, the Soviets, had more respect for local realities than we Americans. I tend to think we were and remain far more vigorous and insistent that the world conform to our model, right? The Soviets, I could be wrong about this, but I don't think so. I think the Soviet communist notion of universalism was more in the idea form than in the reality form, right? Remember, they lost 20 odd million people in the war. Stalin, after the war, was very clear: forget about world revolution for at least 40 years, right? We can't afford it. And he advised the European communist parties, notably the French, the PCF, just do your parliamentary work. We can't do much for you. The Americans, after the war, having won in 45 so triumphantly, we just picked up the theme and never let it down. And there may be among your listeners people who take issue with these judgments of mine. They are judgments. They are subjects of continuing debate. But I think what we're looking at now tends to reinforce my point. We are probably in for a reignition of the war in Syria. I do not think we're going to see a let up in our merciless campaign against the Venezuelans. The Iranian situation is complicated. I'd love to go into it with you, but I don't think there's going to be much change in the position taken by Biden, Antony Blinken, Secretary of State, and National Security Advisor Jake Sullivan. They're already signaling that they don't seem to intend to change very much from what Pompeo left on the table, right?
Right.
All this, here we come, humanitarian intervention, here we come once again, right? All this, I think, supports my contention that American universalism is much more deep-seated, in the end, much more pernicious. You don't see the Russians going around these days trying to subvert other nations, right?
Right.
They were in Syria at the Syrian government's invitation. Let us not forget that.
No. And I think the same could be said of China. I think there's a great deal of difference between the way they are approaching their Belt and Road Initiative and the way the U.S. approaches trade agreements and so-called development in the third world. Yeah.
We could paint the sun black, but by way of our distortions of China, right? You don't have to go any further back than Zhou Enlai's 5 principles in the 1950s. 4 of them had to do with non-interference in other nations, non-aggression, respect for the sovereignty of others, peaceful coexistence. You can't name an occasion when China has transgressed these principles. Even honest hawks have to acknowledge that, right?
Mm-hmm.
They had the war on the border with Vietnam in '79, an exceptional case. Okay, nowhere else. They don't drop bombs. We've got it down now that they want dominion over all of Asia. It's completely conjured nonsense, Charles. Right?
Yes. Mm-hmm.
And you're quite right. It's even more the case with China. Xi Jinping and his people have 1.4 billion citizens to worry about. Do you think they're going to be interested in colonizing Singapore? They don't have the time. They don't have the intellectual wherewithal, the strategic wherewithal. What in the world would they want to do that for?
Right.
You know?
Yeah. Well, there's so much more we could talk about. I think we're coming to the end of the program at this point, but yeah, you're right. There's so much more that we could discuss here. I mean, each one of these countries, we could go on for a half hour about each one, but I think we probably better not, at least at this point. But I hope you can come back and we can continue these conversations.
Anytime, Charles. We're kind of in the middle of one, if I may say.
Yes.
So anytime you want, we can do a part 2.
All right. Well, I'd like to do that. Yes.